Yeah, let's go back to the history of computers. We remember maybe from the first year when we had the introduction to programming course that we talked about this topic already. So just a short review of that. Remember Mr. Babbage's steam computer and this famous story of Ada Lovelace. So this happened in 1871, and here we see a replica of this steam computer that was actually never finished in Mr. Babbage's lifetime. And then we remember what happened after that. Not so much happened until around the Second World War. So we had the Turing machine, which was a kind of theoretic precursor and kind of a theoretic covering of or preclusion of computers that happened in the year 1936. Then we had the Second World War, where the Allied powers came together to hack the German Enigma coding machine with more and more advanced methods using very first automated calculation, programmable calculation machines. And that led actually to the first usable computers. That was, for example, ENIAC in 1946. Okay, so fast forward from that, we know transistors had been invented in the 1950s by Shockley and others, and that finally led to the development of the first integrated circuits. So people found out that on silicon crystals you can have not only one electrical element, but in fact a whole circuit with resistors, transistors, and so on integrated. And so starting from that, the first more advanced computers could be developed. And you also maybe remember the picture of this computer here from the 1960s. So this computer is actually the one for which the programming language C had been developed. This was manufactured by Hewlett-Packard, and the name of this machine was PDP 11. Obviously, one can see this looks like a 3-generation household refrigerator, the same size, and so on. So it takes a lot of space. And if we look inside this machine and check out what is the central processing unit of this machine, then we see this is not a single IC as we would expect nowadays, but in fact it is a whole board with many ICs put on it. So the ICs at that time in the 1960s, they covered maybe only logical circuits like AND and OR or exclusive OR gates, these kind of things. So it required a lot of these ICs to have a whole CPU. What is a computer? If we define a computer as a machine that executes an algorithm, not in a way that the algorithm has to be defined by the design of the machine, but rather that the algorithm can be modified after the design of the machine had been finished and is free interchangeable between different modules, where we can exchange different modules and so on. Then the first computer that had been planned and designed was the analytical machine of the year 1837. And here you can see a replica of a part of this particular machine. And maybe you remember that a picture of this machine was already on one of the slides in the beginning of the introduction to programming class. The analytical engine was his final construction. Charles Babbage before had worked on many arithmetic machines, but he could not finish this final analytical machine. Fortunately, Mrs. Lovelace, this beautiful lady with a little bit a sad story, a daughter of Lord Byron, came in contact with the design and invented some programs. So in some way she may be called the first computer programmer in history. So Mr. Babbage died, and then for a long time no big progress, actually until the onset of the Second World War, no big progress had been done in the field of computer science. One notable exception is the concept of the universal Turing machine. So that is an idea of a machine, and Alan Turing basically defined a concept of the limits of what such a machine can do. And the concept is of this machine, or basically the features of these machines, is called a universal Turing machine, and it's pretty much identical with what a present day computer can do, and also the limits of a universal Turing machine is identical with the limits of our present day computers. Maybe just a few words about the concept of these Turing machines. So this was inspired by the technology of the 1920s. So Mr. Turing basically had the concept of tape recorders in mind. So he had the idea, okay, the program is somehow written on something like a magnetic tape that is read from ahead, and basically this magnetic tape controls the internal states, a few flip-flop circuits or something like that, and this internal states in combination with the instructions that are written on the tape can also make the tape move forward or backward. So this machine also allowed conditional jumps. So the basic functionality of this machine, assuming that the magnetic tape is infinitely long, is very much the same as a modern computer. As a fundamental limit of a universal Turing machine, Turing found out that the machine in principle is not capable to have an algorithm designed that can find out for any other algorithm that had been defined for a universal Turing machine if this algorithm is going to finish in a finite time or not. And this is one of the fundamental theorems of modern computer science. Computer development made a big leap forward during the Second World War. And here you see one reason for that. That was the encryption tool of the German army during the Second World War. So one problem there for the Allies, for the other side during that war, was that these codes, the encryption was interchangeable, so it could be modified basically every day, and it was a combinatorial task to find out the encryption of the day. And so the hacking of the coding, the encryption, had to be automized. And for this purpose, among other people, Alan Turing used computers, the first computers that had been developed under great efforts by the Americans and the British. So he was able to finally get the clear messages that were encrypted by the German army every day. Fast forward to the 1960s. We know in between was the invention of transistors, some silicon based technology that replaced the vacuum tubes. And these silicon based designs allowed also not only the design of transistors but also other electrical elements like resistors or condensators and so on. So at the end it was possible to print on a silicon crystal an entire circuit, and these circuits were called integrated circuits, ICs. So that were basically what we maybe nowadays also would call a computer chip. And that was the situation of the 1960s. The idea of an average 1960s person of a computer was very blurry and unclear. The 1960s society didn't have direct contact with anything like computers. They were more familiar from science fiction films with computers, and also transistors or integrated circuits, if at all in the daily environment, were used in television sets or radios or things like that, but computers were not part of an average household. And here maybe we can see the reason why. Maybe you remember the left picture here from the first year Introduction to Programming course. This is a DEC PDP 11. For this computer, actually the C programming language has been developed, and as maybe you can realize from the picture, the size of this computer is the size of a 3-generation household refrigerator. So it's a very, very big thing in comparison to nowadays computers. And you also see that Alan Turing's concept of magnetic tapes was not just coming out of thin air. Even in the 1960s computer, you can see that the storage medium of these computers were magnetic tape. So these were these white shaped round things in the middle of that particular computer. Now inside of this machine, the DEC PDP 11, there was the central unit, and that is actually also the main topic of this course, then later, the central processing unit. Basically this is controlling the execution of the program itself. Now in the 1960s, this was not a single chip that is somewhere located on the main board of the computer, but instead the central processing unit was a board by its own. You see here there are many integrated circuits on this board, basically logic gates like AND, OR, and so on. So all of these are arranged here in large arrays of integrated circuits. So this was in the 1960s a state-of-the-art computer. A revolutionary step was then done in 1971 by Intel, and Intel at that time was a spin-off or founded by some people who initially came from another semiconductor company, basically some company that designed integrated circuits that were Fairchild semiconductors. Well, the revolutionary thing of Intel at that time was to place the entire central processing unit on one integrated circuit. And so the first of these one chip or one integrated circuit CPU was the Intel 4004. This was a 4-bit microprocessor. So you see here this 4-bit microprocessor on the top left. This is the picture of it. If you find that somewhere, keep it. Now this is a valuable piece for collectors, and you can get a good money for it. And we see short after that Intel also came out with other one chip or integrated circuit processors, and these processors were called then microprocessors in comparison to the previous CPUs from the 1960s that were basically CPUs as you saw on one board. Their name, by the way, was mini processors. So the mini processors were the predecessor of the microprocessors, and the microprocessors are defined as processors that are on one chip, CPUs, central processing units that are located in one chip, one integrated circuit, one IC. Okay, you see here some of these early microprocessors: Intel 4004, Intel 808, Intel 8080. So you see 3 of them already came from Intel. Since Intel was initially a monopolist, they could charge high prices, but soon competitors came up. So for example, Zilog C80, that was intended as a competitor to the Intel 8080, and then even one step further, MOS technology with a new microprocessor 6502, which also revolutionized the price spectrum again. Basically, this microprocessor was available in a price range of $10 US. So basically this allowed to manufacture computers, and this type of computer was called then a microcomputer, for much lower prices than before. So the emergence of microprocessors triggered what was later called the microcomputer revolution. So a lot of, or many very young entrepreneurs started to design initially hobbyist computers that were based on this new microprocessor technology. And funny enough, initially this whole development was completely ignored by the then very well established computer industry that was controlled by companies like IBM, Hewlett-Packard, or Digital Equipment. So it was possible for very young people to start a company and make a completely new type of hobbyist computer, like a personal computer for the home usage. Initially, the microchip producers probably didn't have a microcomputer revolution as it happened later in mind, but instead they thought more about machines like this one, where actually the Intel 4004 was built in. So this was a table calculator, or the example as we see it here, a Datapoint 2200. So this, for our present concept, looks like a computer on its own. We see a monitor, a keyboard, etc., etc. However, this was a computer terminal, so this machine was supposed to be connected to a machine, to a mainframe computer like this PDP-11, and this had an Intel 8008 microprocessor built in. As I mentioned before, the microcomputer revolution was slowly triggered then in the middle of the 1970s, more by enthusiasts that were able to use these kind of machines that you see here on this slide. For example, and most prominent, the Altair 8800. So this is a computer from the year 1975, and it used an Intel 8080. As far as I know, this was distributed by the American electronics shop Radio Shack. Also, you see some other one platin computers actually from the early times of this microcomputer revolution. For example, the Kim one in 1976, which had a 6502 from MOS technology, and also, for example, the Rockwell AIM 65 that also had the same microprocessor. Around these computers, there was a build-up of some hardcore enthusiast community, and one of these clubs where they met was the Homebrew Computer Club that met in Monroe Park, which is a town near San Francisco. And in the environment of this Homebrew Computer Club that was in Monroe Park, there were also two persons that found what was later Apple computers, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. They met with the members of this Homebrew Computer Club, and at the same time in their garage developed their own first computer that was the Apple I, that you can see here in these two pictures below, closed and opened. And one feature, first of all, it was a one platin computer, but one additional selling point of the Apple computer was that there was a pre-installed BASIC. And I mentioned before, the Homebrew Computer Club consisted mostly of hardcore computer enthusiasts. Only hardcore, because at that time it was very difficult to have access or the contact with computers, because the computers only spoke their own native language, that was the machine language. And now the selling point of Apple computer, and also as we see later in the next slide, of other computers, was that this computer here also had this basic programming language that was much easier to handle. Even school kids could then program these home computers, the PCs. Another famous company, of course, that started at that time was Microsoft. So the first product of Microsoft was not Windows. The first product was also BASIC, and actually the BASIC for this Altair computer that I mentioned before. So also here the entrepreneurs started to work pretty young on their project. So here you see pictures of that are maybe know these people, but they are very young at that time. Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And I should mention also that a person whose name is Monte Davidoff played an important role for this Microsoft Basic. He wrote the floating point arithmetics for Microsoft Basic. That was a big step for this software. Different from the previous two groups, here is now one person who is a little bit one of the forgotten heroes of the microprocessor revolution. His name is Jack Tramiel. He was the founder of Commodore. He was an entrepreneur who was located originally in New York. He was also a Holocaust survivor. He was born in Poland and later moved to the USA, and where there he basically his first business idea was to import typewriters from communist production to America under the brand name Commodore. And he also became very early aware of this microcomputer revolution. He contacted a semiconductor company who was able to produce much cheaper integrated circuits than the competitors. The name of this company was MOS Technologies. And they also offered already at that time the 6502 that we already mentioned before, microprocessor, and this became now the microprocessor of all of the Commodore products of the 8-bit era. So we see here the first one was the Commodore PET, one of the first, Commodore PET 2001, that was mostly sold to schools and educational environments. It was very successful there, and the microprocessor was, as I said, the 6502. And then he came up basically inspired probably by Apple with also a home computer that was the VIC 20 of the year 1980, also using the 6502, the same microprocessor that also Apple used at that time from MOS Technologies. And then finally in the year 1982, the C64, and there you see also the picture of the environment. It's not only the computer, but you had also to buy a floppy disk drive, and maybe you don't realize it, but there on the picture is also a floppy disk. This is an exchangeable magnetic memory medium, so this could store about 130 kilobytes of data, so that was enough for a computer game, for example. So Jack Tramiel was extremely successful with his company. He became one of the big players. Unfortunately, he got in a fight with his investors and he later switched to Atari, and Atari at that time was also under trouble because they were initially a game console company, and game consoles had a big crisis at that time, and partly because of the home computer, microcomputer revolution. And then later they also produced under Jack Tramiel's direction the second generation of microcomputers, 16-bit microcomputers. And to finish up the story of this early microcomputer era, we come to the second half of the 1980s, where these 8-bit microcomputers were already replaced by 16-bit computers. So here you see some examples of that. So the Commodore came up with the Amiga that had Motorola 68000 60-bit microcontroller. IBM came up with the IBM PC, which is the grandfather of all present-day PC computers, and inside was the Intel 8086 16-bit microprocessor that is downward compatible still to nowadays the x86 architecture that's still used in present-day PCs. Also, maybe what is not depicted here, we should also mention Apple's first Apple Lisa and then Apple Macintosh. They had also the 86000 microprocessor from Motorola. Also, there was an Atari 16-bit computer, or a whole series of these computers that also holds the Motorola 68000. And at the end of the 80s, the ARM architecture, basically this were the first RISC microprocessors came up, and one early example of these ARM personal computers that were there at that time is the Acorn Archimedes computer, which was a very technically sophisticated device, but unfortunately commercially not as successful as the other two that are depicted here. Finally, nowadays basically only the successes of the IBM PC have survived inside the personal computer realm.